Wonderful beginning of the holiday season, which will start, God willing, tomorrow night. Two things before we begin. I need to start, first of all, by asking the forgiveness of everybody in this group. Since the time that I was asked to give this class, and tonight, I have actually really developed a totally different topic than was originally advertised. So I apologize deeply for the kind of bait and switch. Anyone who was here who really wanted to hear about Maimonides and his code of Jewish law, God willing, we will have another time to share that discussion together. Instead, though, I have a really, I think, at least to me, a fascinating 19th century story that brings together in a really profound way the themes of Shavuos, 19th century Pennsylvania, the old Jewish community of Jerusalem, that I think is whether it's riveting, I guess you'll let me know, but I really felt the need to share. So again, I apologize if anybody is waiting to hear about the Rambam's Code of Jewish Law. I promise you we'll find another time to discuss it. Secondly, I wanted to dedicate our learning tonight to that this should be an opportunity that our learning Torah together should be a source of merit for our brothers and sisters in Israel who are under attack tonight, this whole past week, both rockets from Gaza, violence in the streets, that hopefully that our Torah study should be a little bit of spiritual protection and that they should be able to find peace and security very, very quickly. Okay, so before we begin our story tonight, I need to start by introducing you to a relatively obscure matter of Jewish law. And again, I'm going to be giving a different version of this class at PZ the second night of Shavuos on Monday evening, which is going to deal more with the legal questions involved as well. But some of it is necessary for appreciating the conversation. So the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin deals for a number of pages with the topic of what's sometimes called as the Noahide laws, right? As many of you may be familiar, one of the elements of Judaism, as we'll call belief in salvation, right, is that God does not only promise salvation, ultimate reward to the Jewish people, right, but really extends that promise to all of humanity with no expectation that they need to embrace Judaism to find salvation, right? And that as long as people follow a basic moral code, what Jewish law calls the Shiva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, the 7 laws that are binding on what are referred to as the sons of Noah, the children of Noah, meaning in biblical terms, all of humanity, right? That the promise of salvation is held out to the entire world. And for about 6 pages, the Talmud discusses the ramifications of these laws. And in the conversation, yields something which may be surprising to many of us, but what later becomes actually codified as part of Jewish law. And that is that the observance of Shabbat is something which is restricted in Jewish law to Jews only. That even though, again, we talk about a seven law system for non-Jews, and the idea that many of the mitzvahs of the Torah, right, can be observed on a voluntary basis by a non-Jew, right? So for instance, in the times of the temple, right, that non-Jews could send sacrifices to be offered on their behalf in the temple by the priests, right? It didn't matter that they were not themselves part of the Jewish covenant, right? The idea, and again, this is reinforced by the prophecy of Isaiah, that my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, that in general terms, right, the observances of Judaism are accessible to non-Jews on a voluntary basis. However, a full observance of the Sabbath, the Talmud rules, is accessible only to Jews, right? And the idea behind this is the Torah describes the observance of the Sabbath, right, as a sign of the unique relationship between the covenantal relationship, right, which really begins with Sinai, right, with the holiday of Shavuos, right, that the Sabbath is an affirmation Ki osi beini uvein bnei Yisrael, that this is a sign, God says, between me and the Jewish people. And in fact, there is actually a whole history in Jewish thought and Jewish liturgy of referring to the Sabbath in blatantly romantic kinds of terms, right? Yeah, again, those of you familiar with L'Chadodi in the Friday night liturgy, right, which talks about the beginning of the Sabbath as going out to greet a bride, right? And there's a tremendous amount of marital imagery, right, tied up with the Sabbath in Jewish thought, right? And all the talk about, again, the Sabbath queen, the Sabbath bride, right? All of this idea of the Sabbath being, as it were, a celebration of the marriage of God and the Jewish people, which even again in mystical tradition is even tied up with the tradition of marital intimacy on Friday night. Right? That all of this is about this idea that we talk about the relationship of God and the Jewish people in very romantic terms, and that the Sabbath is, if to carry it a step forward, right, an anniversary of sorts, right? It's an affirmation of that relationship. And so therefore, Jewish thought rules that for someone who is not part of this covenantal relationship, right, to kind of enter as a third wheel, right, into the weekly mystery of the Sabbath is inappropriate. Now, again, this was never understood to mean that a non-Jew is not allowed, let's say, to be a guest at a Friday night dinner. That's totally acceptable in Jewish law. It's not problematic at all, right? Or even to, in very general terms, right, if they want to engage with the Sabbath, to come to synagogue, anything like that, right? All of that is permitted, right? What becomes a question in Jewish law is whether a non-Jew can observe the Sabbath in toto or not. The general assumption is that is not correct. Now, in many ways, it's a very theoretical law. First of all, non-Jews generally don't care, right, whether Jewish law permits them to do something or not. And again, in very general terms, there were relatively few non-Jews, right, who this was even an active question for them at all. It's really, in many ways, a theoretical position. The one place where it becomes more practical, right, is what about a non-Jew who is engaging in the process of conversion, right? Is it appropriate? Are they allowed to take on complete observance of the Sabbath? And the position that many halachic authorities have staked out is that in that situation, where again you have the relatively unusual situation of a non-Jew who, for the one hand, wants to observe the Sabbath, and number two, cares what rabbinical authorities might have to say about it, right? That a convert in process should be told to consciously violate the Sabbath once every week, right? And that they should, again, they want to, the goal, right, of a convert in training is they want to prepare themselves for a life of complete observance. Right? Conversion is defined in Jewish law as what's called Kabbalah Sol Mitzvos, an acceptance of the notion of being obligated in the commandments of the Torah, and barring that, right, that's definitional to what conversion is, right? So therefore, that part of the process of preparation is studying Jewish law and practicing the observance of commandments, right? But in this specific regard, they are told to do one thing, right? Flip on a light switch, whatever it is, to indicate their lack of observance. So all of this is background to a story that plays itself out in Jerusalem in 1848. So the story is actually recorded in a number of places, but we'll use for the moment this one of the versions that has a lot of details that was published in Germany about a year later. So in the mid-19th century, one of the great authorities on Jewish law who lived in Germany, his name was Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger. He actually was published what might be called the first halachic journal, right? He was the editor of a journal called Shomer Tzion HaNe'eman, which was basically a international publication where rabbis would publish questions and answers on sensitive issues of the day, and there was back and forth and give and take. And from that, the articles that he himself penned, he then publishes as a work of responsa called the Binyan Tzion. So we have recorded in the Binyan Tzion the following question. He says, a story takes place in the holy city of Jerusalem that on Tuesday of the month of Adar 2 in the year of 1848. This Tuesday, the 23rd of Adar, 1848. He says something remarkably happened. He says that a circumcision took place for a person. He says Echad Sheba Heina Mimdinat Morocco L'Shem Geirus B'Fanenu Bezdin Sedek T'Kahal Ashkenazim. He said a immigrant from Morocco, right, to Jerusalem, comes to the Ashkenazi court of Jerusalem. Right, by the mid-19th century, you have Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities in the old city of Jerusalem. This is the rabbi of the Ashkenazi community who is explaining the following situation. Tuesday, the candidate comes before them. He goes through circumcision, right? He affirms his desire to convert. However, right, the circumcision, again, I imagine the conditions for a circumcision, 19th century Jerusalem, probably were not, necessarily the most hygienic of all time, right? And he has not healed sufficiently from the operation to be able to immerse himself in the mikveh, right? In other words, which again would be the final stage of his conversion. And this actually puts him in a category we already find in Talmudic literature called Ger Shemal Vilo Toval, a convert who has circumcised but has not yet immersed, right? And it's only when they emerge from the mikveh that they will fully convert, right? So he is, and again, perhaps in a conversion story, this is not the right term, right? But he finds himself in limbo, right? Not only is he in limbo, somewhere between his pre-conversion status and his conversion, right? But he also he's also still recovering, right, from the surgery itself. He's not doing well. So the way that the story is presented here, right, is that out of his intense piety, right, he refuses to ask a non-Jew to light a fire in his house, right, to warm him up, right, to help him in his healing process, right? Again, we're still talking about late winter in Jerusalem. It can be quite cold, right? And it is a time-honored tenet of Jewish law that someone who is ill is allowed to ask a non-Jew to perform actions that he would not himself be able to do in Shabbat, right? And this is what leads to the institution called the Shabbos guy, right? Nothing doing, right? This convert is way too religious for that kind of, relying on that kind of exemption, right? So he's laying, in bed, teeth chattering in the cold. And somehow the story gets back to one of the rabbis who had been on his conversion panel, Rabbi Asher Lemel. And when the word gets back to him, he says, not only should he call someone to light a fire for him, right? He should light his own fire, right? He's not yet Jewish. He hasn't completed his conversion process. So not only is he allowed to ask a non-Jew, he's allowed to do it himself. And he takes a step further. He says he really should not be observing Shabbos at all yet. His conversion is not complete, right? And he orders him to violate Shabbos. That's the version that's version number one of the story. Version number two of the story is found in another collection of responsa by Rabbi Yosef Schwartz. A fascinating person in his own right. He is really a geographer living in Jerusalem, one of the first people. He was trained academically, also in Central Europe, then makes Aliyah. He moves to Jerusalem and does tremendous amount of research. One of the first people to really do what we would call like biblical geography and archaeology. Very interesting person. Anyway, so he tells the same story, right? 1848, the 23rd of Adar, a conversion to a circumcision takes place on Tuesday, right? Comes Shabbos, right? And his version is that the conversion candidate gets a message from the Ashkenazi court, right? That he must violate Shabbos in some way. And here it's a very poignant story the way he tells it. He says that the convert refuses. He says, look, I've personally been keeping the Sabbath. I never heard of this thing before, right? Nobody told me about this special violating Sabbath. I've been keeping the Sabbath now for years. He says, and now, right, I'm in the process of entering the Jewish community. I'm already circumcised. There's no way I'm going to do it. And the messenger says in this version that by order of the court and the power of the Torah, you are forced to do work. And as long as you haven't immersed, you're still not a Jew. And therefore, you are a Gentile, and a Gentile is not allowed to observe the Sabbath. And he says, and again, it's such a poignant story. He says, "Va'al korcho huchrach lichtov." They forced him to write, right? That he wrote his name out. He signed his name in whatever foreign language of where he came from. He wrote it crying, right? That he was crying that now where he really feels he is entering the Jewish people, that he is being forced to violate the Sabbath. The next day, all hell breaks loose in Jerusalem, and this becomes a cause célèbre in the city, right? That most of the other rabbis, and it's a complicated thing because this Rav Asher Lemel was actually a substitute rabbi, right? The rabbi of the Ashkenazi community at the time, his name was Rav Shmuel Salant. He actually has descendants here in Pittsburgh. A very distinguished rabbi. He was visiting Poland at the time, and so again, there's a issue. Had this man overstepped his bounds, right, in making this kind of a very painful request of this conversion candidate? And there is a tremendous literature that exists in Jewish law trying to, both the Binyan Sion, Rav Yosef Schwartz, and others, that this was talked about really all over the rabbinic world. The general consensus is that the rabbi who ordered him to violate the Sabbath was incorrect in his legal assumptions here, right? He made a really big mistake. Why is more complicated than what we are going to deal with today. But in other words, it gives you a sense, right, of, and as you can imagine, things seem to have gotten pretty heated over this question. So that is, again, and this is a well-known case in Jewish law that was written about somewhat extensively in the middle of the 19th century. But what I'd like to do is I want to take this in the background and introduce to you a Pennsylvanian 19th century Jewish conversion story that we will see connects to this in a surprising way. So to do this, I want to introduce you first to, again, a fellow Pennsylvanian. Okay, everybody should see this. So this gentleman in front of you is named Warder Crescent, right? Warder Crescent was born in 1798 in Philadelphia, that place that people outside of Pennsylvania assume is probably a 20-minute drive from Pittsburgh. He was raised as a Quaker and became apparently a very well-to-do farmer, right? Again, Pennsylvania in those days was very well known as a very significant agricultural center in the country. And from a very young age, Warder Crescent was a religious seeker. Right? He was someone who was interested in trying to come to discover really the truth about God. Right? America was a very religious country in those days. Again, this was a time where there were all kinds of interesting sectarian groups within the country. And he was a member, kind of did a little bit of hopping, right, from group to group. He left the Quakers behind and was involved in denominations, including those that anticipated the second coming of Jesus to be happening very, very quickly, right? That was something that was out there. There was a clear kind of messianic edge to a number of Protestant sects that existed in that time. And by the time he is already in his 40s, in 1844, that Warder Crescent becomes convinced that God is going to bring the Jewish people home to Jerusalem, that the end of days are coming, and he wants to go and see it, right? And he decides that he is going to go off to go to Jerusalem, but decides it might be a good idea, right, to have something to do when he comes to Jerusalem, that there has not to date been an American consulate in Jerusalem. And through his Congressman Edward J. Morris, lobbies the State Department to have him appointed the Secretary of State, the consul to Jerusalem, and he goes off by boat to Jerusalem to do this. Now, it's interesting in a work that he later writes called The Key of David, that Warder Crescent tells you how much it costs to move to Israel in those days. I'll give you just a quick thing. Hopefully you can see this clearly. So this is from his book, The Key of David. And he goes through, he breaks down the trip, right? So it's 11 days by steamer from Philadelphia to London, right? Then another goes from London to Marseille, Marseille to Malta, Malta to Alexandria, Beirut to Jaffa, Jaffa to Jerusalem, right? 21 and a quarter days. If you want to do it in style, first class, it's going to set you back $190.75. And I guess it's important to realize that on 3 of the legs in the journey, meals are included. And in a, unfortunately, in a prediction of what's going to happen to travel as time goes on, right? On the trip from Beirut to Jerusalem, meals are not included, right? So you're recommended to stock up on food before you make this this way. And he has some other options here that may take you. You can go on a boat from Boston to Smyrna, and then for another $14 go to Jerusalem, right? So there are different options, right, that existed. So Ward Crescent finds himself in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, while on his trip, the Secretary of State, a man by the name of John Calhoun, who you might be familiar with some of his other exploits in American history, is told that Ward Crescent is not necessarily super stable. And by the time he winds up in Jerusalem, he discovers that his appointment as what would have been the first American consul in Jerusalem has been canceled. So that being said, Ward Crescent decides he is going to stay on in Jerusalem. Again, he had come as an evangelical, expecting to see Kibbutz Golios, right, the gathering of the exiles. But instead, right, he becomes a slightly eccentric fixture in Jerusalem and becomes more and more impressed with the Jews of Jerusalem. Now, the Jews of Jerusalem at the time are an impoverished lot, right? There are Jews that have now, for really all over the Jewish world, there are pious Jews who have come, some of them old men who want to die in the holy city, others who want to devote themselves to lives of godliness. In Jerusalem, you have Jews who've come from various parts of Western Europe looking to escape modernity, right? And the inroads that's making in commitments to Judaism in Western Europe at the time, and are looking for something more profound in Jerusalem. And he becomes very impressed with them against the backdrop of there is also a significant Christian missionary presence in Jerusalem as well, right? Most of these, again, funded by really by English Christians, right? There's a strain in British Christianity, particularly British Protestantism, that is very focused on the idea both of the ingathering of the Jews and the conversion of the Jews, right? And again, this actually is historically, if you're interested in how American evangelicals came to be invested in Israel, as invested in the state of Israel as they are, some of the theological roots go back to these groups, right? This is, again, it's a long and complicated kind of story, right? But there is something there. And it's interesting that there were many of these Jewish communities were receiving funds from British missionary organizations, while at the same time, right, rebuffing the efforts at conversion that are taking place there. Now, Warder Crescent, right, who came playing for one team, right, finds himself identifying more and more with the Jewish community of Jerusalem and becoming much more contemptuous of the attempts of missionaries to try to convert these Jews. So in this same book that this comes from, called Key of David, he talks really very derisively about this missionary activity, right? And implying a very unusual kind of metaphor. So this is what he writes. There was a time when good old cheese became not only very unpopular, but all who had it in their possession were very much persecuted. And there were several very serious objections brought forward against it, sufficient, it was thought, to justify the disuse of it, provided a counterfeit could be introduced into society that would at least look like it and have this one property. The mere appearance was deemed indispensably necessary. For every objection was brought against all the valuable and excellent properties of the real article, good old cheese. Now, if you haven't broken through the metaphor yet, right, what he is referring to is the good old cheese is Judaism, is the Torah itself. And the accusation here is that the missionaries are trying to peddle, as we'll see in a second, sawdust, right, under the label of good old cheese, right? So he writes over here, let's see, this seemed to justify the society and the mission of the society in trying to use every means for its abolition by the introduction of sawdust instead of the real article, right? And he says all of these missionaries were raising the hue and the cry that good old cheese itself smelled too strong and tasted too oily and greasy, right? And again, you can see the skewering of various kinds of anti-Semitic tropes against Jews. They thought, as sawdust looked in every respect very much like the graded article, and this imitation has doubtless been very grating to the Jews, right? Perhaps a overplayed pun, right? It might safely be recommended to the Jews, in particular to all classes of society, for their use. Therefore, it was thought indispensably necessary immediately to establish a society in England, Scotland, America, and elsewhere for promoting the use of it, right? The quote unquote sawdust among the Jews, especially in Jerusalem, where it is well known they have in their possession the genuine and excellent article of good old cheese itself, right? So clearly you are dealing with a little bit of an offbeat individual, but it's fascinating to see, right, how he has essentially is changing teams here, right? That his biblical understandings and research and his connections and his observation of the Jews of Jerusalem have led this product of classic 19th century Pennsylvania to throw his lot in with the Jews. And as he writes, right, we'll switch to another screen here and we'll come back to it in a second. His description is that he came to Jerusalem. He left everything even dear to him on earth, right, where he remained for 4 years. And he says at the very end, and again, we're coming back to Shavuos here as well, I remained in Jerusalem in my former faith until the 28th day of March, 1848, when I became fully satisfied that I never could obtain strength and rest, but by doing as Ruth did, or saying to her mother-in-law, or Naomi, the Jewish church, entreat me not to leave you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people are my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, will I die. Right? That he has seen himself, and again, the classic biblical conversion narrative, right? That he is cleaving to the Jewish people, and therefore he writes, on the 28th day of March, 1848, I was circumcised and entered the Holy Covenant, became a Jew, as the above words prove that Ruth became a Jewess, although a stranger, right? So he wraps things up and he decides he is going to then go back to Philadelphia to be able to wind down his affairs there with his intention of becoming a full member of the Jewish community in Jerusalem, right? And again, we'll skip ahead for a second and then come back to this part of the story, right? Is that that in fact takes place. He joins Mikveh Israel. Some of you may have been to Mikveh Israel, one of the first, maybe the first synagogue in America. It's still a functioning Sephardi synagogue in Philadelphia. today. I've had the opportunity to pray there on occasion, and to tour there. He lives a fully halachic life. He participates in the Jewish community of Philadelphia. And in 1852, Crescent, or as he calls himself, Michael Boaz Yisrael, returns to Jerusalem. And he has, again, a fascinating vision of being able to create what at the time was unprecedented, but within the next couple of decades takes place. So in many ways, he was a visionary as far as this is concerned, right? That he had a vision of establishing an agricultural colony outside of the walls of Jerusalem in order to allow the Jews of Jerusalem to become self-sufficient. So there is an empty area outside of Jerusalem, outside the walls of Jerusalem, which is where everyone lived at that time, called Emek Rephaim. Right today, if you go to Emek Rephaim, I'm sure many of you have been there before. It is one of the leading restaurant and coffee house scenes in Jerusalem. Right, people late at night, you can go even to late at night down Emek and see people sitting outside the coffee shops and the restaurants and socializing. But it was empty and abandoned in the 1850s, and he actually produced literature trying to get this going. It didn't succeed, but he marries a woman in the community there, and he dies in 1860, right, as a honored member of the Jewish community of Jerusalem, and was buried on Har HaZeitim, on the Mount of Olives, the ancient Jewish cemetery that faces the Temple Mount. And that cemetery, under the 19 years of Jordanian control, much of it was destroyed. Many of the graves were desecrated, but is again a functioning cemetery. And in the last 10 years, the grave of Warder Crescent, or Michael Boaz Yisrael ben Avraham, has been discovered. We actually have, this is the, it's a little hard to read. I'll read the parts that are clear. The God-fearing man who came to seek shelter under the wings of God's presence. The soul that's departed the world. Michael Boaz Yisrael, who dies on it's a little hard to make it up. It looks like the 11th of Cheshvan in the year 1860, right? So this is actually the gravestone of Warder Crescent. Now, I left out an important part of the story that we'll go back to now. When he came back to Philadelphia, he is still married to a Christian wife that he has not seen in 6 years, who is very, very unhappy with her husband's, right? Again, now you have, right, he shows back up now, right, with his yarmulke and his big beard, and she is aghast, right, at this situation, and decides to try to have him declared insane, right, and to have him committed, and that as part of that process, again, we mentioned before that there was definitely money at stake here, right? That part of the idea was declare him insane, right? In unfortunately, a time-honored tradition in family law, right? And therefore, to be able to have full control of his assets. So Warder Crescent contests this, and this drags on in court for a year. It's written up in American newspapers at the time. It became kind of a this very kind of bizarre story. This man runs off to the Ottoman Empire, becomes a Jew, comes back, and it becomes actually a very interesting, and there were a lot of editorials actually written at the time in his support, right? That part of what was being established was the idea that people's religious convictions, right, cannot be dismissed by others as mental deficiency, right? That people have, again, kind of an extension of the general American principle of freedom of religion, is that his beliefs, however unusual they were by the standards of the time, cannot be seen as proof of insanity. So in his book, Key of David, he actually goes through this case, okay? And you see at the top, the lunacy case, or the great lawsuit for becoming a Jew, right? And again, in a very pointed kind of way, sees this as a face-off between the father and the son, right? Elizabeth Crescent versus Warder Crescent, she representing the son. The son said the son can do nothing of himself. And so it proved when she lost the suit, right? Again, pretty kind of fighting words. And he goes through, again, he was definitely a very sharp kind of person, right? And goes through his whole story about the divorce and everything that followed, right? And again, that he goes through the question of what his wife has done with the money. I mean, he gets really into a lot of details. And it's a sad story. His family turns against him. There's the evil son-in-law. I mean, there are a lot of very weird twists to how this story unfolds itself. But here's the point that we had missed before, right? So if you take a look over here, right, he mentions that his conversion takes place on the 28th day of March, 1848. Now, it happens very easy to the internet to check dates, right? So if you take a look at the 18th day of March, the 28th day of March, 1848, right? It lines up to the 23rd day of the month of Adar. Okay, it says that's the day that he converted. Now, this is, as it were, the smoking gun in this whole story, right? Remember, we began with the story, the very sad story of the convert in Jerusalem, right, who refuses to violate the Sabbath in the middle of his conversion process, right? So in actually both versions of the story, it tells us exactly when it took place. Yom Gimel, Chav Gimel Yerach Adar Sheni Shnas Tov Reish Ches. It happened on Tuesday, the 23rd of Adar, in the year 1848. So here we have the calendar again, March 1848, okay, which corresponds to the 23rd day of Adar, 5608. And we come to what would be a remarkable coincidence, right? That this is the same date that Warder Crescent says the day that he converted to Judaism, right? Is the day that both the Binyan Sion and the Divrei Yosef both identify as the day that this individual was circumcised for conversion and was not able to go to the mikvah, right? So there was actually somebody picked up on this about 10 years ago and wrote an article who said that it seems like the likeliest scenario is that these are one and the same stories, right? And there's the story of the convert, famous in rabbinic literature, and the story of the Pennsylvanian convert are one and the same. Now, if you remember the beginning, I had told you that the tshuva of the Binyan Sion says that the story takes place took place of someone who came from Morocco, right? Somebody who came from Morocco. Now, it's an interesting question why somebody would specifically come from Morocco to Jerusalem for conversion, right? At the time, right, Morocco actually had a much more thriving Jewish community than Jerusalem did, right? Morocco was a old and established community at the time. Certainly he could convert there. That's question number one. Question number two, right? What would bring such a person, a Moroccan Arab prospective convert, to deal specifically with the Ashkenazi court in Jerusalem, right? You would think that the Sephardic court in Jerusalem, which existed at the time as well, right, for someone who came from an Arabic-speaking culture, right, would be a much more natural destination, right, as opposed to going to the Ashkenazim who spoke Western languages that would be more congenial to someone coming from America. And the way that Morocco is written in Yiddish transliteration in the letter, right? Maraka, Mem Aleph, Resh Aleph, Kuf Aleph, right, is very similar to the way that one would write America the same way, America and Morocco. The suggestion, which I think is absolutely true, right, is that these stories are one and the same. That on the 23rd day of the month of Adar is the day that Warder Crescent presented himself for circumcision, right? And certainly the story that we read of the version of the story where he is he refuses, and then in tears feels compelled to violate the Shabbat due to the opinion of this one rabbi in Jerusalem, right, is very consistent, right, with the unusual strength of character, right, and the independence of mind, right, that certainly is characteristic of Warder Crescent's personality. So I found this story so striking, right? And there's the idea of, all that he sacrificed, all that he gave up, this American Christian man, right, who sees in the impoverished Jews of Jerusalem, right, really a role model of spiritual growth, of a community that he feels meaningful to throw his lot in with them. And I really thought that going into the holiday of Shavuot, which is, after all, in the end of the day, Shavuot is fundamentally a conversion story, right? It's a story about how the Jewish people as a whole dedicated themselves to God, rejected the idolatrous elements of their past, right? And pledged themselves and their progeny for all time to be devoted to God, to be devoted to the Torah. That's the story of the book of Ruth that we read on Shavuot, right? The paradigm of the righteous convert. That's the story of Warder Crescent, again, to bring it back to Shavuot one more time, right? And his love of the good old cheese of Judaism, the idea that he came to a place where he saw any kind of substitute for the Torah itself as being mere sawdust, right? And wanting the good old cheese of Judaism, learning to appreciate it. And I thought, what an incredible thing to going into Shavuot, right here in Pennsylvania, in the homeland of Warder Crescent. So I hope that everybody will take a moment if anybody has any questions on what I hope you found this fascinating a story, as I did, of the saga of Warder Crescent, of Michael Boaz Yisrael, and his story that ends in Jerusalem, as I did, and hopefully that we'll take him as a inspiration as we come to this holiday of conversion and rededication. A Chag Sameach to all. All right, a good night to all. Get some sleep. Tomorrow is the real deal of staying up.